Hello and welcome to the Bible Hour. Today we'll be talking about 2 Samuel beginning with chapter 2, and we finished with verse 12, but I'm going to take us back to verse 8 and start over from there again just to get a little bit of momentum in the story. And then we're going to be shifting gears and looking at Matthew chapter 23, one of the harshest chapters of the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus speaks the 7 woes and against the Pharisees and scribes. And we'll be talking about that and how to apply that to our lives today. But first, let's begin with a word of prayer. Sovereign God, we pray for our gifts of wisdom and discernment, especially as we hear your word of judgment in the scriptures. May we hear it for what it is. May we hear your hatred of what is evil and your love for us at the same time. Bless us as we seek to follow you and to grow in the gospel. In Jesus' name, amen. So we're dealing with, in 2 Samuel, the story is now Saul and Jonathan have died in battle against the Philistines on Mount Gibeon. All of Israel is in disarray. David is going to be hailed as king by the people of the tribe of Judah. And meanwhile, we're going to hear that one of Saul's sons, Ishbosheth or Ishbaal, is making a claim to the throne. Now, how much he's making the claim is hard for us to say. Certainly, Saul's general, Abner, is promoting him, and he really seems to be the power behind the throne, almost to the extent that he is the power behind the throne, and that there is nobody sitting on it. We'll talk more about that as we go. But imagine the difficult situation these people are in. The Philistines are moving in. Everything's in chaos. It's all falling apart. The thing they absolutely don't want to do is to end up fighting amongst themselves, fighting with one another. They have to somehow try to stay together, or at least work in tandem with each other to face the great Philistine enemy. So the great fear that's going on here is to enter into conflict with one another and have a civil war going on at the same time they're fighting a losing war with the Philistines. So you can understand how bad that would be. So here's where it picks up. Verse 8 of chapter 2, 2 Samuel. Meanwhile, Abner, son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. So that's a city across the Jordan, so it's a place of safety where he can solidify and bring things together. And we're going to see he is going to be hailed as king by a certain number of people. Not everybody, not universally, and certainly not the largest tribe, the people of Judah. He made him king over Gilead, Ashuri, and Jezreel, and also over Ephraim, Benjamin, and all Israel. But notice how that's done. Certain cities are lifted up, and certain tribes, but then all Israel is thrown in together. And that seems to be more of a claim that he is making. So the name of this guy is Ishbosheth, and he is also referred to as Ishbaal. And that's interesting, and I'll tell you that almost everybody agrees that his name was probably Ishbaal, which means son of Baal, or son of one of the Canaanite gods. But here's where this comes in. Baal was a name referring to God, and became more and more identified with paganism and with the other gods. Originally, it seems to be, like a son of God kind of reference, although it did use the Canaanite name for God. Over time, people began to look at that very unfavorably and saw it as a horrible thing, and so they actually perhaps took the name out and named it Bosheth instead, Ishbosheth, which would mean son of shame. We'll see that with another character in this same story, Mephibosheth, which would mean mouth of shame, whose name was also referred to in other places as Meribal, which would mean mouth of Baal, or mouth of God, or mouth of a god. You get the idea. So here's this one claimant to the throne up in the north, and another claimant down in the south. Ishbosheth, son of Saul, was 40 years old when he became king over Israel. And we mentioned last time that 40-year figure gives us a problem. Because if he's 40 years of age, then he is older than Jonathan, which would make him the heir originally rather than Jonathan, which he doesn't seem to have been. So there's two solutions to this. One is to say that the age is wrong and that he's much younger, or the other is to say that for some reason he was not looked upon as someone who could have it because of some feebleness of mind or body or something. And we're going to see there are clues that he's either really young or not capable of command in this story. And he reigned 2 years. The house of Judah, however, followed David. So they never followed along after Ishbosheth. The length of time David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. So there's 7 years and 6 months that he rules down there in Hebron. When he has two of them, he has a rival king in the north. Okay, so that's the situation here. And we're going to hear that David rules there until he moves to Jerusalem, which will become his new capital. Verse 12, this is where we left off last time. Abner, son of Ner, together with the men of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, left Mahanaim and went to Gibeon. Joab, son of Zeruiah, and David's men went out and met them at the pool of Gibeon. One group sat down on one side of the pool and one group on the other side. So what we have here is this meeting of these two rival groups trying to come to some kind of plan, resolution, reconciliation, unity. So they're gathering here around the pool, and then this happens. Then Abner said to Joab, let's have some of the young men get up and fight hand to hand in front of us. So we have this Joab here. Who is Joab? He's going to become an important figure later on in the story. He is the nephew of David by his sister Zeruiah, and she has 3 sons who all are going to appear in this story. And they are Abishai and Asael. And Joab is the most prominent of these. Joab is going to be David's right-hand man, but also a problem. He is ruthless. He is very willing to take action. And he takes care of some things for David that he might be going, I'm glad you took care of that. But he also goes, ugh, I wish you hadn't done that. So they're going to have this complicated relationship, and they are close kinsmen as well. So Joab is there representing David. Abner is there representing his king Ishbosheth, and they're both on this different sides of this pool. Abner said, let's have some of the young men get up and fight hand to hand in front of us. Now there has been great debate over what kind of combat this is. Some people, originally for decades, this was seen as a kind of game almost, because of some of the words that are used here, like a joust, like a formal military competition that gets out of hand. That's one way of looking at it. More commonly now it is seen as ritual combat, and that kind of makes sense here. We don't want to have our two sides fighting each other out. We don't want a civil war. Let's try to settle things by having a few people representing us combat and see where it takes us. That may be what they said. And you can see where both sides thought, well, our guys will do it, we'll do well. At any rate, this is what happened. All right then, let them do it, Joab said. So they stood up and were counted off, 12 men for Benjamin and Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and 12 for David. Now we heard that all of Israel was with Ishbosheth, but only Benjamin is represented here. So 12 people from the smallest tribe. And it's important to note, even though that's the smallest tribe, in some ways that helps you bring everybody together. It's kind of like having somebody from, I don't know, an obscure state running for president, or having somebody from New York running for president, right? You can see then you have all the New York baggage and things going with you, even though you might have more support. In the other case, you have somebody from, I don't know, South Dakota, and they can often win that. It's harder almost for people in these intermediate-sized states sometimes. You get the idea and the picture. So they're battling it out, representing. Each man grabbed his opponent by the head and thrust his dagger into his opponent's side, and they all fell down together. So that place in Gibeon was called Helkath Hazarim, which means field of daggers or field of hostilities. And the picture here is that they all kill one another or wound each other so badly that the contest is a draw. Well, this is the worst of all possible worlds. You know, everybody now is upset, and no resolution has taken place. It's hard to believe that happening, although 12 warriors battling it all out in an all-out combat and feeling pressure to win, maybe that would happen. I don't know, but that's the picture here. The battle that day was very fierce, and Abner and the men of Israel were defeated by David's men. So the picture here is after this, is killing is done, the actual combat takes place, and Abner's side loses. The 3 sons of Zeruiah were there, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Now Asahel was as fleet-footed as a wild gazelle. So there are these 3 brothers that are there fighting for David, all his nephews, and one of them is noted as being especially fast. He chased Abner, turning neither to the right nor to the left as he pursued him. And Abner looked behind him and said, "Is that you, Asahel?" "It is," he answered. Then Abner said to him, "Turn aside to the right or to the left. Take one of the young men and strip him of his weapons." But Asahel would not stop chasing him. So the picture here is that Abner and his men are running away. They don't seem to be terribly frightened, but they're running. They're leaving, they're departing, they're retreating, however you want to put it. And Asahel, the fastest one, picks Abner, and he's going after him. And he won't back off. Essentially, Abner says, "Back off, Asahel. This is not something you're not someone I want to get in a conflict with. Let's separate here. Let's keep this civil as we can, even in this terrible moment." But Asahel will not do that. He insists on going after him. Again, Abner warned Asahel, "Stop chasing me. Why should I strike you down? How could I look your brother Joab in the face? So I don't want to do anything to you. I don't want to kill you. I don't want to harm you because it'll create conflict between me and your brother." But Asahel refused to give up the pursuit, so Abner thrust the butt of his spear into Asahel's stomach, and the spear came out through his back. So the picture is he's running like this, and all of a sudden he stops and just goes, wonk. And the spear, maybe it was pointed, maybe not, just goes right through Asahel, who's running into it full bore. And he dies, right? It's a horrible scene. And now you have this civil war has erupted into this terrible situation in place. What do you do from here? He fell there and died on the spot, and every man stopped when he came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died, because they all recognize this is something that will be difficult to come back from. We have a problem now. But Joab and Abishai pursued Abner, and as the sun was setting, they came to the hill of Ammon near Giah on their way to the wasteland of Gibeon. Then the men of Benjamin rallied behind Abner. They formed themselves into a group and took their stand on top of a hill. So now they're assembling, they're in a defensive posture and a good position. Abner called out to Joab, "Must the sword devour forever? Are we going to just fight this out? It'll have bad. Don't you realize that this will end in bitterness? So there'll be these permanent sides. How long before you order your men to stop pursuing their brothers? You've already pushed this too far." Joab answers, "As surely as God lives, if you had not spoken, the men would have continued the pursuit of their brothers until morning." So I would have done this, but your words are making me think. And so Joab blew the trumpet, and all the men came to a halt. They no longer pursued Israel, nor did they fight anymore. So they pull back and they withdraw. All that night, Abner and his men marched through the Arabah. They crossed the Jordan, continued through the whole Bithron, and came to Mahanaim. So they went through a ravine, is what the word that we believe that word means, and they finally come back home. Then Joab returned from pursuing Abner and assembled all his men. Besides Asahel, 19 of David's men were found missing, but David's men had killed 360 Benjamites who were with Abner. So that means you've got a real conflict with the Benjamites, and that's going to be a problem. They took Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb at Bethlehem. Then Joab and his men marched all night and arrived at Hebron by daybreak. So they go back home, back to where they were started out, and they're going to gather there with David, and they're going to talk about what to do next. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. Now there's no diminishment of this conflict. It lasts a long time, and notice how it's characterized, not as north against south, or as tribes against tribe. Instead, it's pictured as a fight between two houses, the house of David and the house of Saul. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. So already, starting in weakness after their loss to the Philistines, David's now growing in strength and in popularity, while the house of Saul is weakening. And then there's this aside. Sons were born to David in Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon, the son of Ahinoam of Jezreel. So they list these sons and their mothers because he has lots of different wives. And his first one is Amnon, who's going to appear later on in the story in a terrible light. He is going to rape his half-sister and then be murdered himself. His second, Kileab, the son of Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And he's going to not appear in the story at all. So why doesn't he? We don't know. The third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. So Absalom is going to become the son who kills Amnon, and later on leads a revolt against his father and tries to claim the throne for himself. He has long hair. The fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggith. He is going to be the king who tries to take over when David is near death, and he is going to be the chief rival and opponent of Solomon. The fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital. and the sixth Ithream, the son of David's wife Eglah. These were born to David in Hebron. So these last two, again, are just names to us. We don't know anything else about them. And now we get this shift in what's going on in the battle. During the war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner had been strengthening his own position in the house of Saul. We already sounded like he was really strong. And indeed, he is the power behind the throne, but to such an extent, he's really almost what it's all about. Ishbaal, seems to be almost an afterthought. Now Saul had a concubine named Rizpah, daughter of Ai, and Ishbosheth said to Abner, "Why did you sleep with my father's concubine?" So Abner did something that would be considered questionable or traitorous, depending upon your point of view. I would shoot for traitorous. He sleeps with Saul's concubine. And what is a concubine? Well, people argue over this, especially what it meant in their society and in their day. Some people believe a concubine was a slave that someone used as a mistress. Other people believe she was a second class or lower socially wife. And that seems to be more the case here. Certainly, whatever her social position, it's strengthened by the fact that she has 2 children by Saul. So she's seen as being one of his most important relationships, Saul's relationship. Now, Abner, by sleeping with her, is trying to assert himself at a place, a position of leadership, perhaps even over Ishbosheth. So Abner is making a power claim. We're going to see that done specifically by Absalom later on in the story, and by Adonijah, who is going to make a similar kind of move later on as he fights Solomon for the kingdom. So basically, when he does this, Ishbosheth says, "What are you doing? How can you do this? How can you claim to support me and do this act?" And Abner was very angry because of what Ishbosheth had said and answered, "Am I a dog's head on Judah's side?" He said, "Are you challenging me? You think I'm just a dog and I'm working on their side? I'm working against you? This very day I am loyal to the house of your father Saul and to his family and friends. I haven't handed you over to David. It's within my power to do that, but I have chosen not to do that because of my loyalty to you." Well, that could be true. It could also be very strong terms, and we're going to see in a minute he's ready to hand him over. "Yet now you accuse me of an offense involving this woman. May God deal with Abner, be it ever so severely, if I do not do for David what the Lord promised him on oath." Now, we don't know that oath. We know that God promised David the kingdom. "And transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and establish David's throne over Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba." Ishbosheth did not dare to say another word to Abner because he was afraid of him. So again, we get this picture of Ishbosheth as being passive, fearful, non-active, really a figurehead. And Abner is now saying, this figurehead thing isn't working for me. I can't really see myself putting a claim to the throne myself. So the option he is now leaning towards is to reach some kind of a deal with David. And we don't know how much of a deal this meant for Ishbosheth. It could mean that Ishbosheth is out and he'll get rid of him, Abner will, or it could mean that he is going to have some kind of a deal for Ishbosheth to have some kind of minor role in the future. At least that's maybe what he's angling for. But it doesn't sound good for Ishbosheth. It sounds like he might be out of the picture. Then Abner sent messengers on his behalf to say to David, "Whose land is it? Make an agreement with me, and I will help you bring all Israel over to you." So Abner, power broker, now says, "Tell me, how we can make a deal. Let's meet, and we'll bring this, and I'll bring everybody over to you, as long as you give me a good enough deal." "Good," said David, "I will make an agreement with you, but I demand one thing of you. Do not come into my presence," and that's very strong, "don't come here unless you bring Michal, daughter of Saul, when you come to see me." Okay, why? That's his first wife, Saul's daughter, and he sees this as a way of solidifying his control and power. You remember at one point, she was taken away from him by Saul, when Saul was pursuing him, and given to another man named Paltiel. And we're going to see he's kind of a non-entity, but he's going to come into the picture soon too. Then David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, son of Saul, demanding, "Give me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself, for the price of 100 Philistine foreskins." And you remember, Saul said, "If you want to marry my daughter, kill 100 Philistines and bring me their foreskins," as a symbol of their death. And David had done that. So he's saying, I earned her, she's mine, give her to me. And notice how strongly he speaks to Ishbosheth, not as a rival king, but as someone who has basically lost. And so he demands this. So Ishbosheth gave orders and had her taken away from her husband, Paltiel, son of Laish. So he just acts this way, and that may be a sign of capitulation, of hopelessness. We don't really know. Her husband, however, went with her, weeping behind her all the way to Bahurim. Then Abner said to him, go back home. So he went back. So you get this picture of him going, how is this fair to me? I acted in good faith, now you're taking my wife away. What's my future hold? And he loves her, or he's concerned about his pride. But anyway, he follows her weeping, and until Abner just says, go back home, and he's shown to be powerless. So he went back. Abner conferred with the elders of Israel and said, for some time you have wanted to make David your king. So even though Ishbosheth has been on the throne, I've been opposing that, and now I know you want to make David your king, now do it. For the Lord promised David, by my servant David I will rescue my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from the hand of all their enemies. So God gave a prophecy, and I accept that prophecy as being true. We need David on the throne. Abner also spoke to the Benjamites in person. They're the ones who've taken the most grievous losses. Then he went to Hebron to tell David everything that Israel and the whole house of Benjamin wanted to do. When Abner, who had 20 men with him, came to David at Hebron, David prepared a feast for him and his men. So notice last time they met on either side of a pool, then there was a conflict and battle. Now David's saying, come on in, and he throws a big feast to welcome him. So everything seems to be coming together. Israel is coming together as a nation so they can face the Philistine foe, and they're doing it under David's leadership. Then Abner said to David, let me go at once and assemble all Israel for my lord the king, so that they may make a compact with you, and so that you may rule over all that your heart desires. So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. So he's released in peace to bring all the representatives of the people together so that they can have a united kingdom. Just then David's men and Joab returned from a raid. We don't know who they were raiding, Philistines or others, but they'd come back from a raid and brought with them a great deal of plunder. But Abner was no longer with David in Hebron because David had sent him away and he had gone in peace. So Joab comes back and finds Abner gone, but hears about this deal. Now this upsets Joab probably for two reasons, one of which is listed up in the text, but the other one is pretty obvious to anybody who thinks about it. Joab is upset because this is the man that murdered his brother, and he is, killed his brother, but maybe more fair. He didn't want to murder him. He killed him in combat, and his brother was actually refusing to let go, refusing to go in peace. But he also sees Abner as a rival. If he's David's general, and Abner comes over, it's hard to imagine that Abner isn't going to have precedence over him as a deal, right? So Joab could be worried about his own personal power. So Joab went to the king and said, what have you done? Look, Abner came to you. Why did you let him go? Now he is gone. So he implies that he was somebody they should have captured. He's saying that he is a rival and a threat and doesn't see him as a potential ally. You know Abner, son of Ner, he came to deceive you and observe your movements and find out everything you were doing. So he didn't come in good faith. He came to lie to you and deceive you. Now, he may honestly believe that, believing the very worst about Abner, or he may be just saying that. Joab then left David and sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the well of Sirah, but David did not know it. So Abner sends out word that David wants him back, or that David's camp wants him back. Now when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into the gateway as though to speak with him privately, and there to avenge the blood of his brother Asahel, Joab stabbed him in the stomach and he died. So he brings him over to talk, and then he stabs him in the gut and kills him. And certainly this is a low-handed move. Some people cynically say he was doing this under David's command. Now the Bible does not say that. In fact, indicates the exact opposite. But they have said, well, he wanted him out of the way. But it's hard to imagine why David would want this. It seems to go against David's best interests. Abner's bringing all the people together. There's going to be solidity, and you can imagine this creates really problems for David. How do I now bring everybody together, and how do I not allow this murder to affect our upcoming relationship? Later, when David heard about this, he said, I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord concerning the blood of Abner, son of Ner. So he immediately says, this was not my intention. I didn't want him dead. May his blood fall upon the head of Joab and upon all his father's house. Okay, this is Joab's fault. May Joab's house never be without someone who has a running sore or leprosy, or who leans on a crutch, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks food. Okay, may they always be hungry or hurt or sick or have all these different problems. They deserve this because of the blood they have taken upon themselves. So it's a strong word against his nephew, understand. All right? Joab and his brother Abishai murdered Abner because he had killed their brother Asahel in the battle of Gibeon. Okay, so we're told this again. Then David said to Joab and all the people with him, tear your clothes and put on sackcloth and walk in mourning in front of Abner. King David himself walked behind the bier. They buried Abner in Hebron, and the king wept aloud at Abner's tomb, and all the people wept also. Okay, so he leads this big formal mourning for Abner, making it a big deal. And certainly there are political ramifications to this, but he also seems to have a real desire to bring everybody together and to have them recognize that it wasn't his fault. The king sang this lament for Abner. Should Abner have died as the lawless die? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered. You fell as one falls before wicked men. So you were killed unjustly, and this was not something you deserved. And all the people wept over him again. Then they all came and urged David to eat something while it was still day. But David took an oath, saying, may God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if I taste bread or anything else before the sun sets. So he fasts all day as a sign of mourning. And people are asking him, to stop mourning. But he says, no, this is important. We have to mourn the death of this good man. All the people took note and were pleased. Okay, so they see this and they're happy that David's responding in this way. And indeed, everything the king did pleased them. So there's this note too. Well, everything pretty much. They were happy with whatever he did. So on that day, all the people in all Israel knew that the king had no part in the murder of Abner, son of Ner. So, Joab murders this man, and it's interesting to note how David responds to this. It's going to be an issue all along how he responds to Joab, but also how he responds to other members of his family, particularly his sons when they do something wrong. He speaks against it, he seems upset by it, but he doesn't really do anything about it. Perhaps in this case he feels he needs Joab, he needs this strong man who will be ruthless at times, but who will also fight his battles, and who is a close relative. But even though he speaks against him, he does nothing. And we're going to see that same problem come up for his sons. Then the king said to his men, do you not realize what a prince and a great man has fallen in Israel this day? And today, though I am the anointed king, I am weak, and these sons of Zeruiah are too strong for me. So my nephews are too strong for me. Even though I'm king, I don't know what to do about them. I can't really control them. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds. So the solution at the end of this chapter is simply to say it's Joab's fault, Abner shouldn't have died, and he's trying to make signs of reconciliation and peace to bring the nation together. Now, some people have suggested that David did this cynically, that he wanted him dead, and that this was not genuine, all this mourning. However, the book of 2 Samuel is not afraid to show David with all his faults and flaws. It will later on attribute the adultery he has with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah, lay it right on his doorstep and say he's at fault. I think we have to take seriously what it says here, that David did not want this to happen and was genuinely sad and upset about what had taken place. And indeed, I could see that point of view. Abner is an interesting character too, isn't he? He could be portrayed as simply somebody who was cynically trying to take power after the death of Saul, or you could see him as someone trying to keep the nation going in a time of crisis and choosing the best path he saw going forward. And when that path was no longer working with David, and simply feeling this concubine was simply someone available to him. And we also wonder why Ishbosheth wasn't trying to solidify his reign more actively. We're going to see he continues to be a passive figure who until he disappears from the story. So we'll stop there and pick up with chapter 4, verse 1 next time. And now we'll turn to Matthew chapter 23. So Jesus has had several conflicts with the Pharisees and scribes and other Jewish leaders. And now we're going to hear the strongest words from Jesus against these opponents. And I just want to caution us as we start this story. First of all, some people want to discount this. How could Jesus possibly have spoken these words of judgment? It's important to remember that the Jewish leaders will in fact be responsible for putting Jesus to death in a very short period of time. And so the picture here is of them in conflict with one another. And Jesus is saying this is a part of what the religious leaders have always done. The religious leaders have always said they were loyal to God, but yet acted in opposition, attacking and killing God's prophets when they spoke a word they didn't want to hear. And he's lifting that up. I don't think you should hear this as a condemnation, particularly though of them, in a sense that's true, or especially not of the Jewish people. If you were going to make a comparison today, this would be the religious leaders of our time, who are, supposed to be leading people, but don't always do that as faithfully or as well as they should, who have their own interests sometimes at stake. So hear it in that way. A professor of mine put it this way. He said, we often hear the words of Jesus against the Pharisees and scribes as something about them, and we see them as God's enemies. But remember, they're the religious leaders just as we are. And Jesus loved them. In fact, he's going to give a word at the end saying, please come into the fold. But they're going to reject that word and continue on their path. So these are the warning that Jesus gives first. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, so notice who's here, not the scribes and the Pharisees, they departed from the scene, but he's speaking to the disciples and to potential disciples. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Well, what does that mean? They have the authority, they claim the authority of the Torah, they're supposed to explain it and teach it, they're supposed to administrate in the name of the faith. So you must obey them and do everything they tell you. So they often tell you good things to do, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. So that's a chilling word about hypocrisy. They don't practice what they preach. And he's going to challenge this in several ways, lifting them up as an example, saying that they fall into casuistry, which means they get caught up in the minutiae of the law rather than its intent. And they often get hung up on small things rather than the big things they should be paying attention to. And that's true of all of us. We don't always follow up, but he is giving strong words against people who are in positions of leadership. They tie up heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Now, that could be a reference to something that was consciously done by many of the Jewish religious leaders. That is to say, God has called us to be a holy nation, a nation of priests. And so their interpretation of that was to say, here are the laws and the rules for priests in the Old Testament, and they began to apply them to everyone. And that was an attitude that many people struggled with, and I would too. It means that much of the ritualistic laws of the Old Testament get applied to everybody rather than just the religious leaders. Okay, and that makes it much harder to follow them. Okay, so that'll be talked about later on as Jesus attacks this position. And he says that gives them all this work to do, and it makes it harder. And they don't do anything to lift them. In fact, they kind of put more rules on them. And that raises an issue of what we do when we convert people to the faith. How much do we expect them to take on as extra baggage, just the cultural assumptions or things that we have, and how much do we really expect them to do things that will change and transform their lives and be a blessing to them? Then he says this, everything they do is done for men to see. Okay, so he says their religion is often an outward show meant to lift them up socially and have them regarded and respected well. And I can tell you as a pastor, there's always a temptation to do something of that, especially with things that, with our children, this is something that comes up all the time. Some people say, well, my family has to be here or be seen in this way. And so there's a tendency to insist upon a certain kind of behavior, an outward show that way. We can't allow anybody to see that we have problems or bicker or fight. But it could go in other ways, even, what you go at the grocery store, as you're buying things, is somebody going to look in your shopping cart and see what you're buying, so you want to have just the right kinds of things? What kind of car do you drive? How are you seen and perceived by the community? So he's saying this is their primary concern, and this is the example he gives. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassels in their garments long. What's a phylactery? Well, when Orthodox Jews pray today, they have a little box called a phylactery, which is supposed to be a guard or protection. That's what the word means. And they put it on their left arm, and they put it on their foreheads. And there's a little box there, a leather box, with these leather ties around, that has scripture in it. And it has the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And then it talks about how you should bind it on your heart and upon your head. And so they literally are doing that to remind themselves of their need to do it, to have those things on their heart and head and heart, right? So you bind it, you put it here, so when you pray like this, it's right against your heart. You bind it here so the scriptures are right there. So it's an outward sign. But these people have big ones so everybody can see what they're doing and know how religious and devout they are. They have big fringes on their garments to show how religious they are. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted in the marketplaces and to have men call them rabbi. Okay, so a lot of things to hear there. They're doing outward signs that are important to them so that people will know how religious they are and to respect them. Now, to a certain extent, do you appreciate it when people have signs? You know, for instance, put a fish on your car saying, I'm claiming the name of being a Christian, wearing a cross in a prominent place. Certainly clergy have for a long time worn specialized garments or a collar to show, you know, to separate themselves and so that people could know who they are. That could be seen as being a visible witness, but he's lifting it up here as a sign of hypocrisy. And there's a fine line there, right? Sometimes it could be something in one situation and something else in another. But he is saying that, lifting up here. Now, is this true of all Pharisees? Well, we know some of them are going to become followers of Jesus, but he is lifting up the reality that the religious leaders in Jerusalem are in fact going to kill him, showing that they reject him, reject the gospel. And then he says, you want to be called rabbi. What does rabbi mean? It means, oh, esteemed one. Later on it means teacher, and that seems to be almost the effect it has. He says, for you are not to be called rabbi, for you have only one master and you are all brothers. So he's saying titles are a problem. And that's an interesting thing because, wow, what do you do in a church when you're a pastor? How do you have people address you? What kind of titles do you utilize or don't you? And boy, that's just morphed over my lifetime. You know, when I was a child, we were told to call the pastor of our church Reverend. And it was, you know, Reverend Cole or Reverend Hoffines or whatever it was. That's the way we addressed them. When I became a pastor, boy, I did not want to be called Reverend because it made me sound reverent. And I was troubled by that, to be honest. You know, what title do you want or should you have? People told me I should have one because it was improper, especially for children, to address me as John. They thought that was disrespectful and not showing appreciation for my office. Eventually, I settled on Pastor John, and that seems to be the direction most clergy have gone, to use the title pastor, which is relatively not highfalutin title. But you can also see where it's gone in other churches and at other times. You know, the address of father in the Roman Catholic Church. You know, a father in that situation is someone who has authority and power over people as well as respect. So it's a touchy situation. And I've been in places where people have called me, you know, both father because they come from a Catholic background, but padre because they've been in a situation where that's what they call folks. It's funny having a title. And so he's saying here we're all brothers. And we have only one master, Jesus Christ. And I can see where that's true too, right? I can see where Jesus is saying. And do not call anyone on earth father, for you have one father and he is in heaven. Well, that's got to be a reference to a spiritual title. Certainly you can call your father your father. That's done throughout the scriptures and there's no backing off from that. But I think here he's referring specifically to that terminology be given as a spiritual title. Nor are you to be called teacher, for you have one teacher, the Christ. Well, see, that's an interesting thought. I agree that you have one teacher, but can't you have a teacher, a mentor, somebody else? It's a strong term, and I think what he's warning us is putting anybody on that kind of spiritual authority where they're sort of taking the place of Christ. And that raises a whole set of interesting questions about priests being someone who acts as an intermediary. And most Protestants have rejected the idea of one individual being a priest, saying rather the priesthood of all believers, that all of us act as intermediaries if we have Christ in our life to those who do not, or to those who do as well. So he starts there. We have one, so it's an egalitarian picture. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. A phrase we find in various contexts. Jesus seems to have said this and applied it in a variety of different ways in the scripture. And now he begins the woes. There are 7 woes here. The Gospel of Luke has 6. This is something that Matthew and Luke share. It's not really found in Mark, but he adds one here in Matthew. And 7 seems to indicate fullness or completeness. It seems to be a word of apocalyptic judgment. This is the judgment that's coming because of how they're responding to the Christ. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees. So teachers of the law are lawyers, people who studied the scriptures and then interpreted and applied it. It was a professional role. Pharisees were largely lay people who committed themselves to obeying the law in all its nuances. You hypocrites, you shut the kingdom of heaven in men's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. So you are actually making it impossible for people to enter the kingdom. Your work, you should be opening the doors, but instead you're making it more difficult. And you're putting in all these other barriers that are in the way. This is an interesting attack on Christian missionaries when they were bringing the gospel to people in the 19th century especially. Some people saw them as attacking the culture and insisting that if you were going to become a Christian, you had to become essentially a westernized person. So they saw themselves as taking everything in our culture and wrapping it all up in Christianity. And there's some truth to that. Some of the early missionaries would go to a place and say, well, if you want to become a Christian, then you need to dress like this or act like this. And a lot of what they were talking was simply cultural baggage from the West. This is the way we do things, and we're Christians, so it must be the only way. Christians really saw the fault in that fairly quickly and tried to address it, but it was a difficult issue, and it still is to some degree today. There's a tendency to see what we do as Christians as being the Christian way, whereas it may be simply the way we live our Christianity out in our context. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those who enter who are trying to. So you're keeping people out. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as you are. Okay, so first of all, there has been a huge debate in Christian circles about the extent to which early Judaism was in fact trying to win converts. How much do we see of this? We know that later on, Judaism within the Christian context and Judaism within the Muslim context was really unable to proselytize, to share their faith, because if they did, that often had the penalty of death. Okay, so it was extremely hard for them to share their faith. Did they share it though and try to win people over during the time of Jesus? Scholars are now pretty well convinced that they were, but they think primarily to the God-fearers, the people who were worshiping in the synagogues, the people who were already halfway there, helping them to become fully Jews. So here it says that they're searching and they're seeking out converts to the kingdom, and as soon as they win one, they just make it harder for them. So they're winning them for the faith, but making it harder for them to have an actual, deep, meaningful encounter with God. That's a strong statement. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, woe to you, blind guides. You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing, but if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. Here we're talking about casuistry, getting into rules and things. We know that when people swore, they would try to avoid using God's name because it was considered blasphemous. So they would often swear making euphemistic references to God by the temple or by the king who's the one who sits on the throne, or various ways of speaking of God like that. But then there began this whole idea of, well, what does this oath mean compared to this oath, and which oath is really binding? And it gets down to when, like people do sometimes in court, where they will argue about what they said and split hairs over what it actually means, instead of getting down to the root of it. So they're arguing about this minutia. And then he says, "You blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing, but if anyone swears by the gift on it, he is bound by his oath." And so they've gotten into this hair splitting. He says, that's all, don't do that, which is really more important. So he talks about that a little bit, but really we know Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, way back in earlier chapters, 5 through 8, he talked about let your yes be yes and your no be no, and don't take any oaths, period. You blind men, which is greater, the gift on the altar that makes the gift sacred, gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, he who swears by the altar swears by it and everything on it. And he who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it. So, don't get into that hair splitting. If you're swearing to God, or euphemism that refers to God, you're clearly binding yourself. So don't get into that kind of casuistry. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. So there is a tendency always for those who get into following rules to have some of the rules just get carried out to the least little part, and then forget about some giant thing that we should be paying attention to. So his example is tithing. This is the only time Jesus really talks about tithing in the New Testament. And their thought was that, of course, tithing, when it's originally spoken of, is really a reference to your income. But later on, there are a few mentions of agricultural things. Now, herbs in your garden, though, wow. This is something that comes up, I believe in tithing, or more than tithing. I think you set some sacrificial goal and you try to give in that way. I don't think there's anything particularly sacred about the 10% figure, because I think God owns everything you have. But I can tell you this, you could get into real minutia here about how, I earned $5 there for I sold a jar of jam to my neighbor. Now I've got to give 50 cents to the church. Is that what you need to do to be faithful? What about my herb garden? Do I have to give 1/10 of the basil that I grow? I can tell you, you start going down that path and your head starts to hurt over how the minutia there. It would really be time consuming, and it seems like a focus on a rule rather than on a dedication to God. I think about this and other things too. Just recently I paid for a fence, and I got a refund back for $150, and 4 of us have been pooling together here. So we all had different amounts of the fence we had paid for it, so I got a formula and broke it all out. But Joy said, well, is it worth doing that? And I said, for $150, I think it is. But if it had been $20, I probably just would have said, forget about it, it's too much work. At what point do you start paying attention to those kinds of things? So they're saying in this case, these people are really paying attention to all the minutia. But you've neglected justice and mercy and faithfulness. Well, that's really got to be what the gospel's about, isn't it? You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. Now, Jesus said you should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. So you should tithe, but you shouldn't neglect the big things of justice and mercy and faithfulness. Or you should have paid attention. I guess the other way would be more true to what it's saying. You should pay attention to justice and to tithing, but you should do justice and mercy and faithfulness. They're both important. Now that's the only reference there, and so some people have said, well, Jesus then teaches tithing. Wow, that's reading a lot into these verses. I think what he's really saying is pay attention to the big issues of life rather than a specific 10% formula. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. Now in Judaism it was forbidden to eat insects of certain types. A gnat was one of them. But how do you avoid eating a gnat? I don't know if you've ever been in a place where there are tons and tons of gnats. Well, it's difficult, right? It's easy to swallow them in your soup or however. So what they would do is strain it out to make sure they didn't swallow it. He says, so there they are, straining out the gnats to keep themselves ritually pure, but at the same time swallowing a camel, which is both comical because it's a huge animal that you couldn't swallow, but it's also an unclean animal that they're forbidden to eat. So, you're paying attention to this little tiny bitty thing while you're doing this gigantic thing wrong. I think of the Apostle Paul when he was persecuting the church, encouraging people to stone the Christians to death while he held their cloaks because he didn't want to participate in it. That would have made him ritually unclean. And you go, wow, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. I'm willing to participate in murder, but I just don't want to get my hands dirty. That's the kind of thing I think we're talking about. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. So they're all big about washing out the outside of the bowl, but they're not washing what's inside. And we've all been in homes that are clean, but maybe messy, and in homes that are really filthy, but look kind of okay, because the things that need to be cleaned are not being cleaned correctly. You know what I'm talking about. You just go, ooh, there's a filth down here that really is kind of dangerous. And so he's challenging them. He's saying that's morally where they are, spiritually where they are. Inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. So they're outwardly have the signs of religion, but inwardly they're going in the wrong direction. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside also will be clean. So clean the inside, and things will take care of themselves. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs. Now, in ancient Israel, during the time of Jesus, people would wash tombs so that people would know where they are. Contact with the dead made you ritually unclean. So this was especially important to do for people who were pilgrims coming to Jerusalem. They might come all the way for the Passover feast, for example, and then run into contact with a tomb without knowing it, and then be rendered ritually unclean and unable to participate in the festival. So they were to whitewash the tombs as a sign to people to avoid them and keep away. So he's saying to them, you are like whitewashed tombs. You are looking like you're ritually clean, look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of dead men's bones and everything unclean. So you look good on the outside, but inside you're not where you should be. In the same way, on the outside, you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside, you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. And finally, this last woe. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. Okay? You build tombs to the prophets to commemorate them. And there are several tombs built to honor some of the prophets who were murdered. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our forefathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So we wouldn't have done that. We wouldn't have acted in this way. So you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. They are your fathers, and they really are your fathers. You're their spiritual descendants. And so it's hypocrisy because you are doing exactly the same thing. You say you wouldn't act that way, but you're doing it today. Fill up then the measure of the sin of your forefathers. You continue on doing the same things they did. And in fact, they're going to be responsible for killing Jesus. The Romans are too, others are responsible, and I know in a spiritual sense all of us are. But he's really challenging them, here, the religious leaders, and I think we hear this as us today. Then he says, you snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? We think of John the Baptist talking and using that kind of language, talking about them thinking they would be saved because they were children of Abraham and how that was not going to save them. So he calls them snakes, not a good word. And then he says being condemned to Gehenna, which is the little valley outside of Jerusalem where child sacrifices were performed during the days of the kings, and where trash was burned because it was considered an unsacred area. Therefore, I'm sending you prophets and wise men and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify, others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. So you did this in the past, you're about ready to do it Jesus now, and you're going to do it to my followers in the future. So you're going to complete the trifecta. And upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. I tell you the truth, all this will come upon this generation. So in a certain sense, it's them coming upon them now because they're continuing the work that was done in the past. So it mentions here the blood, innocent blood shed from Abel to Zechariah. Well, Abel is obviously the first righteous man to be murdered in the Bible, so his story makes sense. And then this Zechariah is an interesting figure. When this same scripture is referenced elsewhere in Luke, the Berechiah is left out. So the reason why this is controversial is because they seem to be saying from Abel to Zechariah, from A to Z, from the first person to the last one. And it raises some issues on which Zechariah is talked about. There are at least 27, and many people say 30 different Zechariahs in the Bible. And the Zechariah that dies here seems to be one referenced in 2 Chronicles. He was stoned to death between the altar and the temple wall, and so he seems to fit this perfectly. The problem is that he is the son of Jehoiada, not Berechiah. So what do you say about that? The son of Berechiah was the second Zechariah, the one who is the prophet that the book of Zechariah refers to. And in ours, that means he would be the last prophet. If he was murdered, then he would be the last prophet in the Old Testament to be mentioned. So you have from Abel all the way to here. Other people say, no, they just got him confused as they were talking about him, and it was the other Zechariah, and that 2 Chronicles was actually, with the way they organized their books at that time, the last book of the Old Testament, covering all these. There's an argument to be made for that. Clearly what he's saying is, from A to Z, from beginning first to last, you're responsible for all those, and that really you have the same attitude in your head and mind as those in the past. You're looking at the prophets and rejecting them, and you're rejecting the Word of God in this way. So we'll stop there and pick up next time with the lament, the words that Jesus speaks to try to draw all these people to repent and to come into his kingdom.